Oh, you don't have no idea.
No.
I see it bouncing. Something's working. Yeah.
Wait, we won't be in escrow because it won't be coming on. It won't be on the market for a few weeks.
Okay, I'm gonna untrap myself. Do this.
I was spending way too much doing this. And because I'm a mentor, I gotta know what I'm doing. Anyway, I gotta be able to follow.
Joe, what's in frame?
The TV.
And not me, right?
I haven't seen you for months.
We have a broken piece of equipment that is making this less than ideal.
What's broken? The YouTube part?
No, well, yes. There's a splitter that's not working.
The last one I saw, I think it was July.
Hi, everybody. Bear with us. Has anybody ever been in an experience where technology has worked when you needed to? Just curious.
Looks like it's all over the world today.
Okay, so yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Has anybody ever had a printer work when you have to run through a listing? I've heard that it happens.
Send the copy to journalists so they can.
Sure. That's cool.
Am I
You wanna
live?
show Eddie what's on screen? Okay. So that's what's appearing. You don't get your face, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
If you want to get your face, you have to stand exactly.
Okay.
Stand in front of the TV.
I might start there. Hey Joe, if you have a stool, you can come over here and then you can ask me any questions if you, or you can break in. Or actually, you can sit where you are if you want.
Sure. Okay.
So where are we? Are we at 10? We're at 3 minutes to 10.
3 minutes to 10.
11. 3 minutes.
11.
Oh, darn. That means I don't have an hour and 3 minutes.
Your class is till 12:30.
Awesome.
Yes. You got time.
I don't know if you guys know this, but I can be a talker, so hopefully I can keep it under. I think we can, though. Keep it in frame. Good, how are you? Ooh, look at that.
Some of the times that I like it is she likes years ago, she came out here with
She's on her own. Yeah. She can do what she wants. What does she do? Really? Similar to you. Subway engineer.
Oh, yeah, I think we're working our own open houses right now. Oh, we're trying to get leads, but you're welcome to stop in. Yeah. Yeah. And this one is a co-listing with EXP, so I have to also stop, yeah. But when we have availability, like, well, you work during the week, I was gonna say this week they're out of town. So if somebody wanted to work like in the middle of the week, like a week, but I think next weekend we're gonna do like the Twilight open house, Saturday and Sunday again, unless we take it off. So if you wanna send yeah, like I think Saturday and Sunday we're gonna split the shifts up. So we're open like 11 to 4, but you could take like 1 to something like that. Yeah, so why don't we let you know? You guys are.
Okay, it is 11 a.m. Are we on YouTube now, Joe? Yeah, we are. Hello, YouTube. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go stand over here. Hello, YouTube. So I'll start right here. So we're going to go over the forms today. I guess, you know, I gave some perspective at our recent team meetings. I've been giving a little bit of perspective, so I'll do that really quickly. So the NAR settlement happened somewhere around March. Or at least we got wind that there were some big changes that were definitely coming. Every year in June, our association, CAR, does a forms revision. You know, some years it's a major revision, some years it's just minor revision, some formatting, etc. This year, on the slate for revisions, there were a lot of forms. Prior to the NAR settlement even happening, it was going to be a big year for forms revisions. Then the NAR settlement happened, and the CAR attorneys realized that they needed to step up and help us work with the changing real estate landscape from the CAR decision. So we wound up expecting even more forms. So in June, when the release was scheduled to happen, we had seen drafts for something like 60 forms, about 40 of which were already in the queue to be revised this year, and 20-something were added after the NAR settlement to help us deal with the new real estate environment. On somewhere around June 24th, the release was supposed to happen. You know, somewhere like a week before that, we got a peek at the 60 forms. On the release day in late June, or maybe 2 or 3 days before, CAR sent out a notice saying that they were going to continue with the release, but that they were only going to release the forms that didn't have to do with commission. They were only going to release the 40 or something forms that didn't have to do with commission, because the ones that did have to do with commission needed further review. It's my understanding that the DOJ wanted to take a look. CAR needed to just make sure they had everything right. CAR last week on the 10th came out with those last 20 forms for our consumption on car.org. So not in zip forms yet, but on car.org. When they released those remaining 20 forms that had to do with commissions, they looked pretty different from, or some of them looked pretty different from the forms that they had shown us before, the drafts that they had shown us that they had expected to release in June. And frankly, they got a little bit more conservative with their language and what they were offering on the forms, from my point of view. So we have the new drafts now, and they're going to be released for use next Wednesday, the 24th. They're going to be in your zip forms library for use. So we're going to go over those forms today. We're going to talk about how we use the documents, the residential listing agreement, the buyer rep agreement. We're going to talk about some of the kind of accessory documents that help us along the way. And then if we have time, we'll take some questions. the biggest takeaway today, actually, I'm just going to give you the takeaway right away. The biggest takeaway right away is kind of the takeaway that we've had certainly since March and even earlier, that the agents in this room or on YouTube who work with buyers need to negotiate commission with their buyer client. Our commission landscape has changed. Traditionally, we would negotiate commissions in a listing agreement, and traditionally, sellers would agree to pay a cooperative commission for buyer's agents, and a lot of what we've expected has happened with even less wiggle room than we expected. You should be going out there negotiating commissions when you're working with a buyer, making sure that you are sure somebody is going to pay you for your fantastic service. So let's start with the buyer compensation advisory, and the people in the room have a copy of this document. So we got a release. This document is fairly new, just in general. We got our first look at a buyer compensation advisory, a broker compensation advisory rather, in May. In anticipation of the rest of the forms being released, CAR released this broker compensation advisory. And the broker compensation advisory is a 2-page form, and it's really meant to start the conversation with sellers and buyers about how commissions work in real estate transactions, and also kind of to set the stage for the fact with those clients for the fact that things have changed a bit, right, because of the NAR settlement. The broker compensation advisory that was originally released in May was pretty different. This is one of those forms that had some pretty drastic changes in just about a month's time. And a lot of what you'll see today in terms of the changes from what we expected and what we're going to see today relate to CAR essentially wanting to kind of wash their hands of any talk of commissions negotiated between two brokers, so cooperating commissions from broker to broker. Where we thought that there would be maybe some side routes to have that happen, you know, broker to broker commission negotiations, CAR at least is looking to step back completely from that being part of what they help us with our forms. So that leaves us with a couple of things. Again, this is a takeaway. That leaves us with a couple of options. Each side negotiates a commission with their client. So seller negotiates a commission with the seller's agent, and buyer negotiates a commission with buyer's agent. Or if we're using CAR forms and what CAR has laid out for us, the buyer can ask the seller in an offer, buyer to seller, not broker to broker, buyer to seller. The buyer can ask the seller as a term in their purchase agreement to take over their obligations in the buyer rep agreement that they have signed. So rather than the brokers being involved negotiating back and forth about their own commissions with one another, the ask that happens, if it happens, is from the buyer directly in their purchase offer to the seller saying, hey, I've got this previous commitment to my client, to my agent. As part of this, the terms of this offer, will you take over that commitment and pay this, this broker in at close of escrow? So because CAR kind of changed things up a little bit, they changed up this broker compensation advisory. So there's a couple of points. I'll just go over the form. That's a little of the background. I'll go over the form now. So the form is 2 pages. I think that I can actually do a little zoom in here. Okay, of some parts. So the form starts on top and it's addressing in the first paragraph, it's addressing the listing agent, the listing agent seller relationship, right? Because we're putting this in front of our clients, and we're going to be able to use this document that's attached to our attached to all of our compensation agreements. We're going to be able to use this document to start the conversation. So the first paragraph talks to the seller about how compensation can work with their listing agent. They're reminded, first of all, that all compensations are fully negotiable, right? That was one of the kind of main points of the NAR lawsuit, is to make sure that the consumer understands that these are not fixed by law and that they're fully negotiable, these commissions. So there's a little bit of background there. And then an addition to the form, after telling the seller, you know, you'll be your client, your seller's agent will come to you with this agreement, this listing agreement. They'll ask you for a commission for their services. After it sets the stage for that, it says, you know, there's something else that might happen in a real estate transaction, and that's where we get to 1B. 1B says, there is the possibility, 1B is optional additional compensation if buyer is unrepresented. So this is a fairly new concept, or at least addressing this is fairly new, addressing this in the forms. You're saying to the seller, who's, you know, the first person that's being approached with this form, you know, there may be situations where we want to think ahead and be prepared for you to, you know, offer me an additional compensation if a buyer comes along and they're unrepresented. So in this changing climate, where buyers are having their own obligations and their own commission requirements with their or commission agreements with their buyer's agent, there may be more and more buyers who decide to come around unrepresented, right? I mean, the car is thinking ahead and thinking this might be one of the kind of complications that we're looking towards, right? Buyers who are unrepresented. So in the listing agreement, and we'll see that in a little bit, the seller and the seller's agent can agree upon an extra or an added fee that'll get paid to the seller's agent if they're working on a deal for the seller and a buyer who is unrepresented comes along and that buyer wants to remain unrepresented. We as listing agents are saying, seller, if that happens, if a buyer comes along, they're unrepresented, they want to remain unrepresented, I'm still potentially going to have extra work to do in this transaction, just kind of facilitating, making phone calls, keeping everything on track and timelines on track, etc. What will you pay me in addition to the percentages that we've agreed upon for my services? What will you pay me in addition if this unrepresented buyer comes along? So this concept of an unrepresented buyer, I want to be really clear, is not the same thing as a buyer coming along and asking you to dual represent. If a buyer comes along and asks you to dual represent, you're going to first get the permission of the seller, get their buy-in on that. There's this buyer, they're unrepresented, they'd like me to represent them. How do you feel about me acting as a dual agent? And if the seller says yes, and this person is going to be represented by you, then we're going to do all of the things that we would need to do whenever we're representing a buyer. We're going to sit down with them, have a conversation, have them sign a buyer representation agreement, have them in the buyer representation agreement tell us what they're going to pay for us to work for their side of the transaction as well, and then we continue on. So again, this option here, this option is not for that scenario. This option is, what if I'm in a situation where I'm working on your behalf and I have to actually kind of help out and keep things moving along with an unrepresented buyer. Whenever we have an unrepresented party on the other side of a transaction, we have to use a non-representation form that we give them. When we're working on behalf of a seller and there's a non-represented party on the other end, a non-represented buyer, we use something called a buyer non-representation form. That's buyer non-agency form, excuse me, BNA. That's something we've had for years now. And it's that safety that we have when somebody unrepresented wants us to help them in the process. Because what we're doing is we're presenting them with a form that says, hey, buyer, you don't want representation, you're not paying anybody for representation, you've made this choice for whatever reason. I need you to be really clear that anything I do going forward is going to be, I'm doing it for the benefit of my seller client. So if I provide you disclosures, if I help you facilitate or organize anything else, it's always, every step I take is for my client. As an added piece, I think it would be wise, if you're ever working with an unrepresented party on the other side of a transaction, to lead off or end any email you send with a caveat that, I'm sending you these documents per our conversation, again, you've chosen to work unrepresented, I'm doing this on behalf of the seller. To put some kind of caveat, we're going to ask BRLG if they can help us with some language that we can kind of attach to emails in these situations. It doesn't happen very often, this unrepresented party situation. The most common situation is FSBOs, where we have an unrepresented seller, in which case we use a seller non-agency form. We're not in a business where we're finding that very much, but we could be down the road. So Carr added this paragraph, and we'll see it on the listing agreement. So in this advisory, we're letting people know in advance that here's different ways compensation situations can shake out. One could be, as your listing agent, that I wind up doing a little bit more because there's an unrepresented buyer and I want to get paid for it. Paragraph C here is some conversation about dual agency, right? So I just mentioned the concept of a buyer who's unrepresented. Well, we're telling the seller up front here in this paragraph 1C that there's also going to be occasions where maybe somebody comes along and they're not and they do want my representation, or maybe there's going to be somebody who comes along and they're represented by somebody else at my brokerage. And I'm just trying to make you aware, as far as disclosure and advisory goes, that that person. You know, we could have a dual agency situation on our hands if somebody else at my brokerage is representing the buyer, if our brokerage is getting a commission from that buyer because one of my other colleagues at my brokerage is representing that other party. So this is really just kind of advisory. It's just letting everybody know, getting everybody on the same page. The next piece here is to buyers. So I said that the form starts off at the top talking to sellers. This is what you should think about and know about compensations, etc. And then we're going to address the buyers with this form. And the buyer section is pretty straightforward. It's saying, hey buyers, if I'm going to be representing you in a transaction, I'm going to expect a written agreement to take place between us, that I'm going to act as your representative, and I'm going to expect that some compensation be paid to me for my services. With the NAR lawsuit comes the obligation for Realtor members to have this written agreement in place with their buyer-client prior to even showing a buyer-client a property. So another element that has really changed pretty drastically, that should be a big takeaway today, that we've discussed, ever since the lawsuit, but that you should just kind of really get into your head, is that you really shouldn't even be showing properties. You will be violating your commitment as a Realtor member and a member of the MLS if you show a property without a buyer representation agreement. So right now, as of the August 17th turnover date, you need to have a buyer rep agreement every single time. And come January of next year, it's expected that even non-Realtor real estate agents, meaning even people who aren't part of our National Association of Realtors, they're going to be obligated by law. Every one of us selling real estate is going to be obligated by law to have a written representation agreement of some kind with the buyer prior to showing the property. So that's prior to showing the property. Just want to drill that home, okay? So you got to get these buyer reps signed. The client is being told then that how compensation works. They're being reminded again that it's fully negotiable, that you're going to come to the table and discuss a compensation amount and agree upon it and get it in a written agreement. And then, let's go, this is a weird setup. Sorry, I'm playing around with a new, our marketing department just gave me this new flippy thing. A middle-aged man using new technology in front of a group. So let's see how well that goes. Okay, advantages of written agreements. So there's a reminder then, so we're still in that paragraph addressing the buyer and telling them a little bit about what they can expect. We're reminding them that there's an advantage of written agreements because we're really clear on everything going forward, right? I'm committed to you, you're committed to me, and we've got it memorialized. Paragraph 3 gets into this. It says, when enlisting a real estate broker to represent them, buyers agree to pay the buyer's broker when escrow closes, but the person responsible for payment may be negotiated in the transaction. So this is when we get into this, okay, maybe there's a little wiggle room space, right? So we started with, hey, seller, you're going to get a commission for just with your listing agent. Hey, buyer, you're going to get a commission just with your buyer's agent. Now we get into buyer's probably going to have to pay the obligation that they agree to in their agreement, but there is at least this one little mechanism we have where a buyer can ask the seller to pay their commitment. It says a buyer pays the compensation pursuant to buyer's representation agreement. A buyer's broker may negotiate the amount of compensation directly with the buyer and then document the agreement in a buyer representation agreement. The buyer then becomes contractually obligated to pay the broker by providing funds to escrow prior to the close. So this is a contract. This isn't just a an agreement that you're planning to work together and that you're committed to one another, et cetera, et cetera. It's a commitment for some funds. If I do this, you will pay me this. This contract, this buyer representation agreement, an aside, if the buyer is going to be committed to paying that, you should provide a copy of that to escrow during the escrow period. Neil Kalin on the town hall said that we're going to have to start getting in the habit of showing our escrow officers what the expectation is here, that the buyer is going to have to pay that money at close of escrow. But again, we're getting into this what ifs territory. So the first says the buyer is usually going to pay their obligation. But are there scenarios where the seller may pay the compensation? And it says, okay, here's one scenario. B1 says buyer negotiates for seller to compensate buyer's broker. So it says here, I'm going to read the first sentence and then I'm going to tell you, I'm going to get into it a little bit. It says a buyer may make a conditional offer to the seller by including a term in the purchase offer asking the seller to pay the buyer's broker in an agreement they've already made with one another, essentially. So that's when we get to this concept that we've actually been, that's actually been available to us for several years now, ever since the grid was created. When we got the RPA updated and it was now a grid, we've had this line in the RPA, and I've brought it up in this room quite a few times. The line is, the paragraph is 3G3. And that's this line in the purchase agreement that says, as one of the terms of this offer, as one of the things I'd like you to consider in this proposal I'm sending over to you, seller, I, the buyer, would like you to agree to taking over my responsibility to pay my agent. So if we rewind it, seller and listing agent are working together, buyer has an agreement with their broker to pay them, buyer goes to see the property, loves the property, is in a situation where they realize that they want to offer a certain amount on the property, they feel like things are getting really tight, and they say, I would like to make this offer a conditional offer. Like every term in an offer is a condition. Well, one of the conditions of the offer is for you to accept my offer and agree in your acceptance to pay my obligation to my broker. In other words, take over my buyer rep. So that's the kind of, I'm trying to think of a different word other than wiggle room. That's the other little bit of space we have here, right? Either negotiate it and make sure that your buyer can pay you, either you negotiate and make sure your seller can pay you, or ask in the purchase agreement for this payment to be made. So that's this, we're informing the buyer of that in 3B here. In 3B2, it says buyer's agent negotiates an agreement directly from seller. If a seller is unrepresented or does not have an exclusive agency membership relationship with another broker, a buyer's broker may approach that seller asking the seller to sign an agreement for compensation. So this is addressing a scenario where maybe you'd be you have an agreement with your buyer client, a FSBO comes up, because this addresses situations where the seller is not represented. So that the classic example would be a for sale by owner. In those circumstances, we're still allowed as real estate agents to approach that seller and say, I have an agreement with my client, my client and I are thinking about writing an offer. They can write you a really good offer if we can offset some of their obligations to me. Can we negotiate something in something called a single party compensation form? So we no longer have this cooperating broker compensation form because, again, in terms of commissions, CAR wants to move away from cooperating brokers giving each other money. But we have a single party compensation form where the buyer's agent can go up to that FSBO seller and say, I'm going to bring an offer for you, but I'm going to need a compensation. Would you sign this prior to me bringing the offer to you? And that's the idea behind the single party compensation. So this form, this 2-page form about compensation is playing out like really every way that is still allowable if we're using CAR's tools to make it happen. Seller pays seller's agent, buyer pays buyer's agent, buyer asks for seller to take over their obligation in the purchase agreement. Buyer's agent approaches a FSBO seller and gets a single party compensation, and that's about it. for what CAR will allow. So you're, again, going to say it again, your takeaway is get those buyer representation agreements signed, because you may have to rely on your buyer client to pay your commission. And then 3C of this broker compensation advisory is a little paragraph about the changing real estate climate and about the NAR settlement, just kind of keeping the person reading the form informed about the fact that maybe they've sold a house 5 years ago, or maybe they bought a house 5 years ago, and what they experienced was this concept where the seller's paying all commissions, etc. Well, hey, whoever's reading this form, that's all changed, and that's why you're reading what you just read. So the buyer compensation agreement, everything that I cover today, you should go and read yourself, because when you read it, I think it'll become pretty clear. I'm going to kind of summarize what we're looking at, but you still have an obligation to read it. So that's the buyer compensation agreement advisory and a broker compensation advisory, and that always leads the conversation. It's actually even attached to our commission agreements. And then we're going to go into the actual changes on the actual forms, right? So that's the background. That's giving everybody a little bit of a heads up as to what's going on. And let's see how the forms work. And I don't think I can really focus on that anymore. So the residential listing agreement. So hopefully everybody's got one of these in front of them. The residential listing agreement, the good news, or one of the pieces of good news about the RLA that has nothing to do with the commission situation, is that they've reformatted it so that it looks like the RPA. So it's probably 3 or 4 years ago that the CAR attorneys took the RPA and they decided, you know what, let's front load this document with all of the kind of moving parts, the terms that change from offer to offer, from home to home, et cetera, so that it's kind of easier, more easily consumed. The consumer can read it more easily. So that's a good thing. And the grid, like the RPA, is about is this first page and a little bit of the second page. There are fewer terms on a listing agreement, right? Most of us who are buyer's agents and seller's agents know that the terms in a buyer's offer, are extensive. But in a listing agreement, there's just a handful of things that we got to get straight before we list somebody's property. So the terms all appear in this first page here, and most of them, are going to be really familiar to you. They're just front loaded here and they're all in order. So, and I will say, actually, just let me back up and say, everything I show you today in terms of listing agreements, this is all duplicated on all of the documents that are like the listing agreement. So the commercial listing agreement, or the probate listing agreement. Like, if there's another listing agreement out there, it's been reformatted the same way. So if you're used to using like a multi-unit or something like that, it's been reformatted in the same way. So let's look at it. So the top is pretty straightforward. We're asked who's who, right? Who the seller is and who the broker is that they're employing, what the address is and assessor's parcel number is, and then we get into the actual terms in the grid. First thing is pretty straightforward. What's the listing period? There's a beginning and an end date that you need to fill in. A little word of advice. You always have to make sure that there's a beginning and an end date. If you have any impulse to leave that blank, know that it is a serious DRE infraction. The contracts have to have, these real estate contracts have to have a beginning and an end date. Something that has been updated on the form as well is that the form says that the listing period is not to exceed 2 years. And that's from a law that passed in the last couple of years, that we can't have these open-ended listing agreements that last for 4 years or something like that. Just 24 months, it says. The next is listing price. Again, you're filling in an actual number, and if anybody's in the habit of like a TBD or something like that, there's real questions about whether or not something like to be determined could be enforceable. Actually, I've heard from our attorneys that it's probably not enforceable to be determined. So what's the point of getting an agreement that can't be enforced? So put in a price. It can always be modified later when you get closer to the to the time. Yeah, give it a try. Oh, he did figure it out. You're the best. See, he's about 10, 12 years younger than me, which helps a lot in these situations. Okay, so that's the where was I? The listing price. Always fill in an actual number. You can always modify it later. Property-specific listing. So the default on this purchase agreement, on this listing agreement, is that it's your typical single-family, residential 1 to 4. Single family or residential 1 to 4 of some other type, your regular listing. The next line on the agreement, or the next little gray spot here, is that reminder, again, that we're going to see over and over, that's always existed on our listing agreements. From what I'm told, Missouri didn't have language like this. We were drawn into all of the fun of the commission argument, and we've always had this language. The amount or rate of real estate commissions is not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually, may be negotiable between seller and broker, et cetera. And our conversation should always go that way too, right? That it's always negotiable. And then we get into the negotiation section. So between these two gray, the compensation section, so between these two gray bars, we get into the nitty-gritty of compensation. And the first line here, 2C1, is pretty straightforward, compensation to seller's broker. What you'll notice is that language is added that says only seller's side of transaction. Well, that's new, right? Because our listing agreements, if everybody remembers, our listing agreement, it used to have a gross amount that the seller is going to pay, and then it would break out how much was being offered to the cooperating broker. Well, that's no more. That's the whole point of all of this. That's why we're all here today. That has been removed, and it's just not a thing. So we see compensation to seller's broker only seller side. So the number that gets plugged in there is probably not going to be 5%, 6%, whatever. I really actually should not get too far into numbers since we're on YouTube. It should be just what you expect to be paid for your services as the listing agent. There's no cooperating, there's no sharing on this line. That is what you're expecting to be paid for your services. And then, so that's pretty straightforward. And then we get to line 2C2, which talks about this additional compensation to seller's broker if buyer is unrepresented. I think I covered that pretty clearly with the broker compensation advisory, but this is where you would check a box and say, hey, you know what, seller? There's always the possibility that somebody's going to come along unrepresented. And I know that I put in X amount in the compensation to seller's broker line, but I'm going to need this little extra bit too if a buyer comes along that's unrepresented and I have to do things for them. And that's where you would fill in, another % or two or whatever it is that you'd be asking so that you could help that along. Not a bad idea in this climate to get yourself set up with something in that box. Those are the two, that's the big takeaway here on this form. We're going to go through the rest of the form, is that there's no co-op commission offer. We knew it was coming, and here it is. There's no even talk on this form about a concession or any other offering that may be used to pay a buyer's broker. And the original versions of this form that we saw suggested that we might see some language that's additional, optional monies that could go towards buyer's broker, et cetera. But they just decided completely against it. They're washing their hands of it, CAR. They don't even want mention of it on their forms. So as a listing agent, you're just dealing with on this form, you're just dealing with what your client is going to pay you. And we'll get to the what ifs in a little bit. The next line on the form says continuation of right to compensation for broker identified prospective buyers. So this is not a change, it's just a rewording. So we've always had this concept of a kind of trailing commission obligation. So if after a listing period ends, we provide a list of buyers that have come along to the property that were interested or wrote offers, et cetera. We've always been able to provide that to the seller so that we're that we are still saying we deserve a commission on that person that came along. right? Everybody's familiar with that in their listing agreements. Well, now they're calling continuation of right to compensation for broker identified properties. And you set in a date in there. The continuation period shall be 30 days or 60 days or whatever it is, so that if this expires or cancels or whatnot, but somebody was active, a buyer was active, and they were gonna, thinking about buying your property, and they've come to visit it, et cetera, and then they don't do so, they don't write that offer until after I'm out of the equation, I'm probably still owed a commission if I've given you their name. That's been reality for forever, but there it is. The next line is 2C4 is seller's obligation to pay previous brokers. So this is where we're going to be sitting with our client, and this isn't really new either. We're going to be sitting with our seller client and saying, are you obligated to pay anybody else? Like, you just got out of that list agreement with John Smith over there at Compass. Like, did he give you a list of other names of people, of buyers that might have come along? I need to know that now so that we can exclude them, and I can have a sense of it. And or any other obligation owed, you would fill it in there. Not a lot's changed except for the compensation part. Now we'll go further down the grid, and we'll get through the grid, and we can talk about how we can find out if the seller is willing to pay a concession of some kind. So the rest of the grid, the rest of the page, 4D2 talks about items to be included or excluded in the sale. That's pretty straightforward stuff, right? Listing those items that the client might want to, that the chandelier would go anyway, but maybe it was my great-grandmother's chandelier, and even though it's attached to the ceiling, I don't want the buyer to have it when we close, so let's list it in the excluded items, etc. We would do that here. The next line is letting the client know, the seller letting their agent know if there are leased items like propane tanks, solar panels, etc., liened items like heating and ventilation systems, etc., etc. Let's get down to the bottom of this page. Joe, I'm going to need your fancy hands to get us down to the bottom of this page.
You can click and drag.
Click and drag?
To move it around once you're zoomed in.
Okay, so our listing agreements have always had that a lot of language and paragraphs dedicated to the concept of an MLS and the use of an MLS as a marketing tool by agents. Those of you who have filled out a lot of listing agreements know the paragraphs I'm talking about. We traditionally would have to have our clients initial that they've read and understand the MLS, that we opt into using an MLS, etc. Well, CAR, when they were revising this form, decided to take the MLS piece out of the actual listing agreement and create an addendum that becomes an automatic attachment to the listing, and that document is called the MLSA. So MLS addendum. MLSA just gets automatically attached. It goes over all of the MLS information. We're asked here in the actual listing, when it says property will be marketed in the following MLS, and we're asked to name the MLS, our association name here, but then our client gets that MLSA. So a couple words about the MLSA. The MLSA talks about the change per NAR. It talks about the way the commissions aren't going to be offered on MLSs anymore, that's just a new reality. And it also has a paragraph, or it has a space. I wonder if I have one included here. I'm not really sure. I might have a new package. Yeah, there we go. It's the next form. The MLSA has, has informs the client about the MLS, why we think it's a good idea for them to allow us to market their property in the MLS, why we do think it still generates and syndicates the most, creates the most opportunities for our client, it exposes the property, etc. And then on this form, it says, what is the MLS? There's an explanation of that. Can we go down a little bit? It talks about the benefits of the MLS and why it's probably not a great idea to opt out of doing the MLS. It talks on paragraph 3 about clear cooperation and the requirement of members of the MLS to list the property or list it as coming soon and not to market the property publicly unless we've done one of those two things. It tells the seller, we're familiar with this because it used to be in the listing agreement, it tells the seller, hey, do you want me to market this right now, or do you want to check a box here that says you're going to instruct me to start marketing the property on another date, right? So that's when we're prepping a property. We're used to that on our actual listing agreements. We check a box and say, no, we're not going to actually expose it to the market for another month or so. Let's go up to the top of this form. Okay. And then there's the option to not actually market the property at all on the MLS. Again, you need to have a conversation with your client about the advantages of the MLS. Then there's a paragraph 4. This is all stuff that was in your other listing agreement. There's a paragraph 4 that talks about how data is shared on the MLS, that certain information about the seller's property is going to be syndicated out through the MLS to other websites, and et cetera, et cetera. But where I want to go right now, the change, or where things get kind of a little substantively different, is this paragraph 5 that got added to the MLS Act. So I talked about buyers getting agreements with their buyer agents, sellers getting agreements with their seller agents, each of those parties paying directly to the person that's representing them, how there are very few ways to get around that. Well, here's where we get into this concept of a seller concession, right? So co-op commissions have gone away, compensation to somebody else's broker has gone away, but we have this concept, we have an expanded concept of what a concession is now. And so here's where we've got a little bit of a tool to kind of maybe offset some of the buyer's obligation. So it says here in seller concessions, it says concession explanations. Well, first it starts talking about like what a concession is in general, right? Concessions are monetary payments that a seller agrees to contribute to its buyer's expenses. Traditional concessions may include costs of title and escrow, lender fees, repairs, inspections. Like in the real estate industry, we've been familiar with this concept of a buyer asking a seller to fix a fence, or give me money towards the fix of a fence, or to pay for my escrow fees, or whatever it is. We've asked for concessions before. It's not a new thing. It says here that sellers, concessions identified in an MLS listing are not promises to pay, but instead indicate to a buyer. So this is from a seller's point of view. Any concession offered is something that's just indicating to a buyer that the seller will consider concessions if they're asked for. Concessions specified in the MLS are not intended to be binding on a seller unless included in the acceptance of the purchase agreement, right? So I talked about the purchase agreement being the tool to get everybody to agree to pass on an obligation or to give a concession. It shouldn't happen outside on some other document or in the MLS. So again, concessions identified, specified in the MLS are not intended to be binding unless it is included in the accepted purchase agreement. Concessions specified in the MLS must be allowed to be used by any permissible buyer expense or cost and must not specify the concessions are to be used for broker compensation. So whereas some concessions maybe can be used by a buyer, like the offering, the willingness of a seller to pay a concession could telegraph to a buyer that there may be some money that the seller could kick back, where the seller should not be advertising that concession as being something specifically that can be applied to the compensation, because CAR really wants us to stay away from that kind of language, at least in their documents. So can the buyer ask for the concession to do that specific thing? Yes, in 3G. They can ask for it to be towards the payment of their buyer's agent compensation. But the MLS is saying, we don't want you on our MLS or elsewhere saying, hey, we have a concession so that you can pay your buyer's agent. We just use the term, the seller may be willing to pay a concession. And leave it at that. And the buyer gets to decide what it's applied to if the seller does agree to a concession. So how does that happen, or what's the process then for all of this, right? This concept of a concession. Well, again, CAR wants to wash their hands of it, but what at least they did is they gave us this one authorization line on this MLSA, this document that's always attached to the listing agreement. they give us 2 lines in this paragraph. It says seller, the default is seller does not authorize broker to put in the MLS that seller is willing to consider offers which ask for concessions. So that's the default. No, seller is not willing for us to telegraph to the other side that there might be a concession available. Or we check a box and it says seller authorizes broker to put in the MLS that seller is willing to consider offers asking for concessions, if allowed under the MLS rules. Even if permitted by the MLS, no amount of the possible concession will be stated in the MLS either as a percentage or a purchase price or a flat fee unless seller notifies broker in writing of the agreement. So a couple of things about these concessions that this is getting at. The concession, we can get here a checkbox from our seller saying, I'm willing to offer a concession. We can even talk to our seller about what that concession would look like. You know, our seller could say to us, I'm willing to potentially offer a concession of up to 3% if I happen to get the right offer, right? So I'm not committing. All this is non-committal. It's just that they're giving you the ability to say that they're open to this being a term in the purchase agreement. And the MLS is saying, no matter how different MLSs are handling this, one thing we'll tell you, CAR is saying, is that you're not going to be plugging in a percentage or an amount there. You're just going to be telegraphing that a concession is available. The rest is going to have to happen conversationally, probably, and it's going to have to appear in the purchase agreement. So the way this kind of on the ground would work out, and I actually got an email just the other day from Bay East that they're adding a concession line. The way this would play out is that in your listing agreement, you agree to how much the seller is going to pay to you. You'd open up the conversation with the seller. Traditionally, sellers would pay a buyer's broker's commission in past real estate transactions, but that climate has changed a lot. But there may be situations where a buyer might not have a whole lot of money and they may need the support of the seller to pay their obligation to their buyer. Can we kind of telegraph out there in our marketing and other things that there's the potential for a concession if you write it into the purchase agreement, et cetera, et cetera. And if the seller says, yeah, you know, as long as I'm not bound to anything and this is all, you know, this is still going to be optional and I can review the actual offer to see if it makes sense financially for me, I might be willing to make a concession. So if they say that, they agree to that, we check that box. And our MLSs, when Neil Killen presented this town hall last Thursday, he wasn't sure which MLSs would have concession lines and which wouldn't, because CAR doesn't control the individual MLSs. They make their own decisions. And he said most of your MLSs, I expect, will have a line for concessions and come August 17th. And I was waiting to find out, and I got an email the other day that Bay East says they will add a line for concessions, but that line presumably will say, you know, is the seller willing and open to offering a concession, you know, like kind of language that is not committal. And it's going to be like a yes or no. It's not going to be a percentage amount, at least in my reading of these forms, because it's pretty explicit here that it's not to be stated as a percent or purchase or of the purchase price or a flat fee. So the little bit of wiggle room we got here is that our MLS listings may mention that the seller is open-minded about a potential concession, meaning open-minded to us asking in the purchase agreement for the seller to pay the commission. So that's it. That's the big spot on that form. That's the big little piece of helpful space that CAR gave us. Well, quite frankly, I feel like they're trying to distance themselves as much as possible from getting involved in this. But they gave us that. So let's look at the buyer representation agreement. Did all of that make sense before I move on? Does all of it seem pretty clear? I mean, it's not ideal. You can raise your hand if you want to say, I don't like it, because then I'd raise my hand too. But is it pretty clear going forward? Okay. Buyer, I don't know what that QR code is for this.
If anyone wants to follow along digitally, you can scan that and be looking at the same thing.
Oh my God, that's why I needed Joe. Joe's the best. It's my partner in crime here.
Leave that up for a quick second.
Okay, buyer representation agreement. So now we're going to go into the buyer rep agreement. So we've got our listing agreement, basically removing that co-op commission. We've got our MLSA that talks about this concept of maybe a concession being available, but we can't rely on any of that, right? Like in our relationships, when we start talking, we shouldn't be relying that somehow the commission is going to get magically be paid if we're representing a buyer. So we have to master the buyer representation agreement, and this is something we've been talking about for probably a year, but we got really heavy on it in October, and then we doubled down on it in March when the settlement came in. Everybody needs to be getting a buyer rep agreement to protect yourself, because we need to get paid for our services, right? So the buyer rep agreement also got formatted to look like the RPA. It also got the nice upgrade of being in a grid form so that it's all kind of front-loaded with terms and information in a more easily consumed format. There are some straightforward pieces to the buyer representation agreement. We'll go line by line. One thing I want to point out is towards the top in red here, you'll see that unless exclusive is checked in paragraph 2A2 and initialed in paragraph 15 to represent a buyer in acquiring the property, this is going to be non-exclusive. So unless you do a couple of things, this is a non-exclusive agreement. That's our default here. And then it says, some things about the terms of the representation, the items in the paragraph are contractual terms of an agreement, reference paragraphs provide further explanation. So this is something I always bring up in my RBA classes that I'm sure you're aware of, but I think that we should be passing along to our clients when we're having conversations with them. There's a handy dandy reference point right here. When you want to learn a little bit more about something you're reading in one of these terms, there's a little handy dandy index or reference point. Be aware that when they made the grid, they were thoughtful about all the other paragraphs of the purchase agreement, about making sure that they're still informing the client fully, but they've just changed things around a little bit where you fill in the term and you can go see more about it. Here it says paragraph 7. The RPA has them in almost every single box, where to learn more about deposits, where to learn more about down payments, etc. So point that out to your clients. I don't know that enough people are. So let's get into the actual terms of the buyer rep agreement. We're making an agreement with our buyer client. We're sitting at a table with them. We're telling them, here's the way it works. I need to get paid for my services, and I need to ask, we need to negotiate a compensation here. So we start with the representation period, and this is a change that was made from the last version of the BRBC we had. The representation period now has a beginning and a set end date. The previous version of the representation agreement had days after as the fill-in, so it would be like beginning date of July, 15th or whatever, and end date 90 days later, something like that. Now it's got a plug-in for an actual date. Or completion of the resulting transaction, whichever occurs first. So we've got again, we always need, with any contract, we need a beginning and end date. And it says, underneath that, it says not to exceed 3 months. So that's newly added as well. There was a law in the last year or so that said that listing agreements shouldn't be more than 2 years long. We didn't have a specific direction in our buyer rep agreement, so we were going with the same kind of concept, but now we're being told that it's actually 3 months, that we don't want to keep a buyer on the hook for more than 3 months with this representation agreement. Now, some of you have worked for, so I'll raise my own hand, some of us have worked with buyers for 6 months or a year, right? Because they're just not getting off the fence or whatever. We can always modify an agreement. We can always, the same way that we would modify a listing agreement to extend a period, there's a modification for a buyer rep agreement so that we can extend the period. So when you're up against that, date 3 months from now, you can reevaluate. Actually, it might be an opportunity for some of us who work with that client who's not serious to have the real come to the table talk and be like, we've been at this 3 months and it hasn't been working. And you might think to yourself, do I want to continue this relationship? But you can always modify it and extend it. Type of representation, again, the type of representation defaults to exclusive, rather non-exclusive, but we can make it exclusive. Our previous buyer rep agreement had a checkbox like this. It said, if you want to make this exclusive, check here, and we'd just check it and we'd be done. The new version is actually check here to make it exclusive and have your client initial paragraph 15. So there's a two-step process so that they know what they're doing, right? So that later when they're going to open houses and meeting other agents and they're trying to get into all kinds of exclusive relationships with multiple people, they can't say to you, I didn't understand what the word exclusive meant, right? You're like, I made you, we not only checked it, but you had to initial that you understood what exclusivity was all about. So that's, I think, a good add. We'll look at that paragraph as we go through the form. Property to be acquired, broker including any associate licensee working through broker on behalf of broker provides services of the types of properties and in the location specified below. So the property type here defaults to single family residential including condos, manufactured homes. That's the default, right? Which is 90-something% of what we usually sell. But then, or maybe 80% of what we sell. But we can check for multis, industrial, land, commercial, et cetera. So if we're using this form to accommodate a different kind of buyer who's looking to buy a different kind of property, we would check the box, but it defaults to single family and condo and manufactured homes. The next line is location. So, you know, we need to, if we're going to make a commitment to one another, we need to kind of narrow a couple of things down. Like, what is our commitment for here? Even if it's an exclusive commitment, am I just your exclusive agent for just the city of Fremont or the county of Alameda, maybe the county of Alameda and Contra Costa, but you may have like a second cousin who's a realtor up in Sonoma and you're wavering and you might want to go with them. Well, I need to know what our exclusive agreement entails here, what our non-exclusive agreement entails. Where are we looking? Where is our agreement based? County and city are there. So you can tailor that out a little bit with your client. Additional description if you wanted to get really granular. Yeah.
So for the county, if we list some county and then
Yep.
the buyer change mind later and
Yep.
looking for the other county, then
You can modify. Any agreement can be modified, right? So we have a modification of a buyer representation agreement. So if you, I would say, if you're making an exclusive agreement with somebody and you're willing to go out to far lengths, make the original agreement that you're going to do Alameda, Contra Costa, whatever, you know, Northern California, right? You know, you can add in all the counties around us. But if you're because there's the additional description, you can add it there, right? But if you were working with them in Alameda and Contra Costa, and then suddenly they wanted to look somewhere else, you would just do a modification and add that additional area. Okay. Additional buyer preferences, and the next line is additional buyer preferences and priorities. With a checkbox, and then there's if we add that, it adds a form. So this BIPP form, again, it's Buyer Identification of Preferences and Priorities is the form. I think I included it, I'm not sure if I included it in your package. If I didn't, I definitely have it in the slideshow as one of our extra forms I want to show you at the end if we get through everything okay. And that's really not a commitment form. It's a buyer identification of preferences and priorities. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's for the buyer to say, I'm looking for a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, I'm looking in these cities, et cetera, et cetera. I look at it almost like as like an intake form, right? Like you're getting to know what the client wants. It doesn't bind them. It doesn't mean that if they say 3 bedrooms that they can't later decide that they want to buy a 4-bedroom house. It doesn't change anything in our agreement. It doesn't like exclude or include anything into our agreement. And then, where am I now? I lost my space.
D.
D, oh, okay, it's because my trusty assistant is scrolling up, that's why. Okay, so E is, this little gray bar says broker compensation. Notice the amount or rate of broker real estate commissions is not fixed by law. We've heard that, right? A bunch of times. And then we get into what we expect to be paid for our services. The amount of compensation is either this percentage or this flat fee, or it can be done in a compensation schedule. If you want to create something complicated and say, if I find you a $2.2 million property, I'm only going to ask you for a 2% commission. But if I find a 1.5, I'm going to ask for a 3% commission. Like, that's what we mean by schedule. If you wanted to kind of customize an agreement because you know that there's some incentive to buying that higher price property and you can cut them a deal or something.
You missed D like in dog.
Buyer, properties excluded from representation. Thank you. It's because of our scrolling, which I appreciate very much, but it's fine, that's fine. Thank you. 4D is properties excluded from representation. So properties excluded from representation would be similar when we were talking about listing agreements, and during a listing period, maybe a listing agent has a buyer come through that's interested in a property. The listing expires. The listing agent traditionally, we send a list over after we cancel or expire, saying, you know, if you get an offer from that person, I want a piece of it. Well, the concept here with properties excluded from representation are if maybe they had another agreement with another broker prior to our agreement with them, and that other broker said to them, I gave them a list and said to them, I've been showing you 123 Main Street for 3 months now, and our agreement's ending. If you go in and get a buyer representation agreement with another broker, I want you to make sure that's excluded because I'm the one that's going to get the commission for that. So it's a matter of conversation right here with the client. We always want to make sure when we're having the conversation with the buyer client about signing any kind of agreement with us, exclusive or non-exclusive, we want to ask them, do you have any other agreements out there going on, right? You have to be really clear with me, and we really need to make sure that if you have an agreement with some other party, that I'm not stepping on their toes and obligating you to another, particularly another exclusive agreement, right? So we're having that conversation, and if they say, yeah, you know what, I just did end an agreement with Jan over at Compass or whatever, you're going to say, is there any properties that you've been shown by her during that period that I need to know about, that she's given you a list for, that she's going to expect a compensation, a trailing commitment for compensation for. So we would put it in that properties excluded from representation. Does that make sense? Yeah.
If that agent doesn't give the buyer a list,
yeah,
does it count?
Yeah, so they're supposed to give a list. It's just like the listing side that you have to, there's an extra step for you when you're, and we'll get to that a little bit. That should be here too, actually. We're required to give over a list.
Do you just leave that blank?
Normal, yeah, probably 8 times out of 10, it's going to be left blank, but your buyer has an obligation to tell you if you ask them if they do. John?
So a former broker was showing the buyer a house.
Yep.
Over a period of time, did not furnish you or the buyer with a list, and you sell them that house.
Yeah.
What happens?
Yeah, so we would be pretty committed to going after our commission in that circumstance, right? There's an obligation for that person to provide the list, and there's an obligation for our client to tell us. We can't.
So they gave you a list, it's on the list, it's on here, and your buyer insists you help them with that house.
Yeah, so we're allowed to say we can't help you. So there's always these forms actually open up a lot of these questions about when we can back out of agency, right? Because we've always had this this reality in our real estate industry of something that's referred to as implied agency, right? When we maybe don't even have a commitment with somebody, we don't have a purchase agreement with them, we don't have a listing agreement with them, we don't have an agency disclosure sign, but we were at an open house and we gave them way too much information, blah, blah, blah. There have been lawsuits before about, like, you implied your agency with this person. So we've always had this kind of like, kind of nervousness around where do we have agency and where do we don't. So my mind with some of these forms when they first started is, if a buyer can't make a commitment to us, they don't have the money, et cetera, maybe we find that out later after we've written this up. Maybe we find it out when somebody comes along and says, ABC. In what cases are we allowed to back out? And the form is pretty clear that they have obligations to us, and we don't have to be involved in transactions where another broker is owed a commission. We don't. We can back away from that. The form's really clear in the paragraphs later about that. And if a client says that they have enough money to pay our commission, and we find out along the line that they're not, even though we've started to establish agency, we can say we're not going to work with you on this transaction, even if we're kind of in the middle of writing an offer for them, and we find out that they want to go really high and they won't be able to pay us a commission. We can actually say, I can't do it. Per our representation agreement, you were going to have that money available to pay me, and in the numbers that we're working out here, that's not going to happen, so I don't have to write this offer for you. So there's a little bit more wiggle room with the idea of canceling or stepping away from agency, and one of them is, to answer your question, one of them is the situation where somebody
in that
has.
scenario, they don't have enough money, but you can write an offer where you're asking for that money. That's contingent, may go through, may not.
That's right.
So you've written an offer, and
My worry
it
is
doesn't get
count.
accepted, I guess.
Yeah, it doesn't get accepted, and that's the reality. And if they try to counter or anything, we can step away. If the seller says, I want to do it without that paragraph paying your buyer, we have the right to step away. My concerns, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole, but my concerns is that it's going to unseemly or unscrupulous listing agents are going to be like, oh, fantastic, I'll make this work somehow. I don't know. We'll have to hear from our attorneys about how they anticipate that scenario to play out, but I do know clearly if we get into that situation where we write in that commission amount because we're relying on it, and the client is absolutely sure, it's the only way they can go forward. They don't have any more money to dip into, that it's written into the RPA or not, then we can say, it wasn't accepted, we're moving away. We're not committed to you. So some of it we'll have to see how it plays out a little bit too. So where were we, Joe? Did you, compensation, continued involvement, so compensation amount, let me just start back from the commissions because we had to go back to D. So you're writing in your compensation amount. I think everybody in this room should have their value statements together. We've been talking about this for a while. You should know what you're worth and go in there with value, and don't count on the idea that maybe we'll get paid some other mysterious way. Go in asking for that good percentage. Get strong early. The next one is payments received from broker, from seller or others. So if broker receives compensation from seller or others for broker's representation or of buyer, that amount shall be credited to the buyer's obligation. So this again is that concept of 3G3 in the purchase agreement. If we've somehow arranged for the seller to take over the buyer's obligation, that will be credited towards, the buyer isn't also somehow obligated to that. And the kicker, or something really important to remember, is it says broker shall not receive any amount in excess of paragraph 2E. So if somehow we negotiated, we were trying to negotiate a higher commission, or maybe we found out that a seller, when they indicated that they're willing to give a concession, maybe we found out from their agent they're willing to give a concession up to 3%. We're on the phone with them. They say we're really willing to give a compensation, a concession up to 3%. And we go back and we look at our buyer rep agreement, and our buyer rep agreement says 2.5%. And we go, oh shoot, they were willing to go up to 3. I could have written in 3. Well, it says here, broker shall not receive any amount in excess of what's on this agreement. So it's going to get reduced back to what's on this agreement. So there was some conversation. So let me get to that. So there was some conversation when we first saw the first drafts of this form that we're going to just have to modify our agreements when we hear about that. Neil Kalin on the town hall last week was particularly non-committal and stayed away from this concept of upwards modifications. We'll see how our attorneys feel about it. He didn't say no, you can't do it, but he wasn't willing to say yes, you can do it. So I think it's going to be interesting. We're going to have to see how that plays out. Whether there's any repercussions to modifying after we hear that the concession is.
So you can modify anything, I guess.
You can contracts can be modified, right? And so so in concept, you would think any agreement that you and I have can change, right? But Carr really wanted to step away from committing there. Amanda?
What about the other way around, where you have a set commission, the seller is willing to pay less?
Yep.
Is that modifiable?
Well, the buyer is still obligated to pay the full amount that they've agreed to here. So if during the negotiations you try to get the seller to give you a concession of X, Y, Z because it equals this number, and seller says we're only going to give you, X, oh thanks, then your buyer's still on the hook for the remainder. They're only getting the benefit of what's been paid. So an agreement's an agreement is an agreement, and you still get the agreement with the buyer that you be made whole. And so if you're not, they're.
It sounded like on
don't have the money.
Well, this is going to become the problem on the ground that I can't answer right here, right? Is how does it play out in scenarios where the client can't come up with the funds? We'll talk about ways to insulate ourselves a little bit from that they've built in here, but it's not going to be a slam dunk in certain.
But Anda's question was, can you modify it lower? And I think it sounds like the answer is the same as modifying it higher, which is probably, but maybe not.
I don't know why you would want to modify it lower.
Well, in Anda's case, like the
for this buyer who can't pay for it.
Exactly. They
Yeah,
can
I
afford
think
that extra whatever.
I think Joe's right that we can't say for sure, but I think there's going to be a whole lot less of an argument or disciplinary action against somebody who's making their client pay them less money than making them their client pay for more money.
So here's
That's
the
just
question.
intuition, not right. Yeah. Mark.
So the seller is offering, say, 2%.
Mhm.
Seller's offering nothing in any of these cases.
Right,
Sells
but
over
this-
nothing.
we call it,
It
and they say-
has telegraphed a concession.
Right, they start giving you 2%.
Yeah.
But I have a signed contract with my buyer for 2.5.
Yep.
Do I modify it below? I mean, I know it's.
No, I wouldn't.
Just leave it.
I wouldn't. This is where you get into the question that Joe asked. It depends on the buyer and whether they're fully incapable of coming up with the rest of that money. But we're working from the assumption when we're filling out this form with them that they've got a path, that they've figured out a path to paying us. And actually one of the boxes says, actually that we'll get to in a second, says, basically they're saying, I'm fully reliant on this being something that can be passed on. And we'll get there. Let's get there and then we'll come back to this. Can you remind me? Because we're about to get there in just a second. So continued right to payment for broker involved properties. So again, this is this concept of a continuation period. It's the same thing that we had in the listing agreement that I talked about, where we're saying if a month after the broker agreement is expired or canceled or whatever, you buyer go to buy that property that I was with you at 8 times and wrote an offer from you or whatever. I'm adding in a continuation period, a period after our agreement ends, where I'm still protected. We used to call it the safety clause, like where you're still protected to getting a compensation. It's similar to the listing agreement, so you plug in a number there. And again, you'd have to provide a list at the end of your period here with this person. You'd have to say, here's a list of the properties that I showed you that I had broker involvement with, et cetera, so that if they go on to the next broker, they have to pay us. Cancellation rights and notice. Non-exclusive can be done upon receipt of the document. Exclusive cancellation has a cooling off period of 30 days, meaning you have to notify me if it's before the term of our original agreement. You're on the hook for 30 days. If you find something else, you're probably going to have to work for me. So exclusive kind of protects us, where it doesn't let somebody just have a bad day and fire us, right? Buyer financial part. So now we're getting into something that's a little bit helpful towards this question that Mark was asking and Anda was asking and that Joe kind of got at. These situations where we're setting up an agreement with a buyer, and sometimes that buyer might really be up against the wall with what they're able to afford. Like they might be really putting it all on the table just to purchase the home, et cetera, and they are really reliant on somehow offsetting the cost of commission, et cetera. We're asking them outright in here on the form. So this 3G, buyer financial personal information. We're telling them that there's time to deliver, they have a certain amount of time to deliver buyer personal financial information. And it says here, within 5 calendar days from the execution of the agreement, you have to let us in on your personal information, what you're able to afford, et cetera. And even better than that, there's a checkbox for a form I can give you. And that form, I'll bring it up later, it should be in your package, is the BFPI. And the BFPI is this buyer financial form that isn't required, but if we check it, we're telling them we're going to give this to you. And on the form, there's nothing there's nothing too complicated about the form. It's saying where are your funds coming from? Where are your down payment funds coming from? Have you gotten a pre-approval yet? And do you have money to pay me? Right? And is there a source or some verification of that? So it gives us a little bit of ability, at least, It's a tough conversation maybe, but it's important because we're professionals and we're going to need to make sure that they're going to pay us for our representation. We're going to ask them to fill out that form, and it's going to help us a little so that in advance of the situation that Mark talks about or that Anda talks about and Joe referenced, in advance of the situation of writing it into the offer and finding out that the seller's not willing to give us the whole amount, you know, we've already kind of had an idea of what our clients' limitations are here, right? If we get countered back by that seller and they're unwilling to take over the buyer's obligation, then we have the right to say we're not moving any further as your representative here, right? But maybe there's a counter or a situation where they'll come to meet us part of the way and we'll decide to move forward. Other terms, we know other terms. Okay, let's go. So some good news. Let's go to the next one. I'm hoping do I have the RPA in there? No. So some good news when we get into this whole concept of that line on the purchase agreement where we're asking the buyer to take over, the seller to take over buyer's obligations, et cetera, is that we had some worry for a while about, can you go back? There it is.
I have
you
the
know.
second page of the RPA.
Yeah, that's what I want.
Oh, okay.
Because I want to go up to the credit lines, 3G1 and 3G2. Thanks, Joe.
RPA page 2 is what we're looking
Yeah,
at.
I did need you, Joe. I don't know if I included this because I in your printouts, because I just wanted to point it out, honestly. I'm just pointing it out that this is where it happens in the purchase agreement. And I wanted to say a couple of words about it. So I've mentioned 3G3, 3G3, like brokers and people who have had to worry about this for a year are 3G3ing all over the place because that's the paragraph here. So hopefully it'll start becoming a thing in your mind too. They added this 3G3 line when they created the grid, so about 3 years ago. And when we saw it, we thought, wow, that's an interesting concept. We know that there's this promotion going on, that we start using buyer rep agreements. We knew vaguely of lawsuits. We thought, wow, that's really a very specific thing we're asking the seller to do in this new contract. 3 years ago. Fast forward, we see and we were told at that time, oh, CAR is thinking ahead, right? And now we see, oh, they really were, because 3G3 says there's a checkbox. If it's not checked, it's not included in the agreement. It just disappears. It's not a line in the agreement. That's true for anything like this. So if it's checked, it becomes a part of the agreement. And it says seller agrees to pay the obligation of buyer to compensate buyer's broker under a separate agreement. Most of you in this room have heard about this because we've talked about it a lot, but I think we're going to start using it because this is the other way, as I've been saying, you know? This is the way to kind of potentially offset the buyer's costs. If you check that, it becomes a term in the agreement. So when you're working as a listing agent, you need to be really careful and thoughtful and make sure that you're reviewing every term of every agreement, never getting lazy with it, because you never know what you're going to find, and it's going to change the agreement drastically. And you need to be able to evaluate as a listing agent one offer next to another offer when one offer maybe asks the seller to take on an obligation for compensation and another offer doesn't. Well, that changes everything, right? So they're both at $1 million, but one's asking you for another $30,000. It's a different offer, right? So you're going to need to be comparing these things side by side. Our fantastic OP, Joe Dickerson, has created a kind of a multiple offer kind of matrix, like a spreadsheet where you can compare two different sets of terms side by side, correct? And where can we find that, Joe?
Yeah, we've sent out the link before, but we can do that again.
Okay, great. So, you know, so as we're doing this listing, this commissions agreements class, this is a really good thing to remember, like an on-the-ground thing to remember, is that we're going to be really thoughtful about the offers that we're evaluating, because somebody may check this box and they're asking for something, and we may need to counter it out, right? If it's not desirable to the seller, we may have to counter it out, but we also need to have the conversation with the seller that that buyer may be relying on it in order to make this offer, right, et cetera. There are two lines here on the top of this purchase agreement that deal with credits, 3G1 and 3G3. And I'm bringing that up because 3G1 is this typical, traditional concept of a concession or a credit. It says seller credit, if any, to buyer, and there's a percentage amount, et cetera, and it says seller credit to be applied to closing costs, right? So we've seen that a billion times in our real estate transactions, probably, like seller, well, maybe not a billion times, but seller's going to pay the buyer's some of the buyer's closing costs. And we all know that lenders traditionally have limited those credits, right? There's a certain cap on what can be provided to a buyer in the way of credit. Usually, in my experience, I think it's somewhere around 3%. They'll cap it out. Well, the fear we had when we first saw 3G3, that one that I'm talking about today, about the seller taking over buyer's obligation, is that lenders were going to start looking at this document and be like, that's a seller credit. The seller's giving money to the buyer. We've got our caps, etc. And so we thought that this mechanism might turn out to kick us in the butt in the end of the day. But the good news is that we're hearing now from lenders, and it was announced on the Car Town Hall, that lenders are going to keep these two things separate. That they're not going to be thinking of that seller obligation to compensate for the buyer's broker. They're not going to be considered that when they're looking at their credit cap numbers. So that's good news. So hopefully that's the case. That's what everybody's hearing. Fingers crossed, and then we're going to have to start probably making use of this in certain occasions when our client is, when we're working with our client, we're going to have to start vetting our clients and deciding whether or not they're really capable of buying this house because they have this new obligation of more money to come up with to pay us. And if they're not able to come up with that money, we're going to need to decide whether or not that we're going to have a tenable client to work with in a competitive atmosphere when they keep having to ask for $30,000 essentially. And so it's going to, unfortunately, in my mind, push some buyers out of our market. I just think that that's a reality. John?
That mentions an addendum that goes along with that.
Yeah, so
I looked at the addendum, it pretty much says what's needed.
Yeah.
I mean, there's math in there, so if you're asking for so much, but they're only giving so much and there's a difference, or if they're not giving anything, there's all kinds of stuff, but it lets you bring it down to a number.
It does, and it's actually been updated, and it's actually, it should be in your packet, the SPBB. And what's that, John? It's called the SPBB, and it's actually in the package, and it's actually one of the last forms we'll look at. And it should be in the package, is it not? If it's not in the package, it's a slideshow. I tried to limit so that you weren't overwhelmed by your package, but I'll get to it in the slideshow. Can we go on? Because we might as well move to that, and I think it's one of the next forms. So let's go, is it not in there? Let me talk about the SPBB then. The SPBB, I may have missed it. I missed it. But to John's point, oh, there it is, SPBB. I did include it on the slideshow. Okay, so the SPBB is the form you use. So John mentioned that there was language next to 3G3 that said that, hey, this is checked, we want you to take over the obligation, we'll tell you what that obligation is in an attached form, right? And the attached form now with the application, the old SPBB used to break down, this is what we're asking of you, but this is what the buyer is able to come to the table, this is what the buyer told us they'd pay us, and there was all this math to do. But now, because it's just, we're asking for the whole amount, we're just going to fill it in right here. We're just going to say, you know, if what we had in our buyer rep agreement is 2.5%, we're just checking and saying it equals 2.5%, or whatever the flat fee is, or whatever. And it's way more straightforward. Ask who buyer seller is, and we're going to provide that with the offer so that they have an idea of what that extra obligation for the seller is, what that extra cost to the seller is.
I think also that's one of those forms that if you check that box, that
automatically
is added.
That's absolutely correct. It'll automatically get added. There is a line here in the paragraphs on this form that says the buyer also has a right. So this is the way that you send the offer over, right? Just to kind of get it out there, tell them what you're looking for. But the seller also has a right to see the third page of the buyer representation agreement also if they request it. And the third page of the buyer representation agreement summarizes again, it says again, here's the amount that was agreed upon. So they can ask for further evidence if they want to, but this is how it gets sent over, essentially. How much time do we have? Only about 5 minutes?
There's a question from the YouTube land about if there's any concern about escrow companies facilitating payments from the buyer to the buyer's broker.
if there's any concerns about escrow companies. No concerns that I'm aware of yet, and actually on the car town halls, they made a real point of making sure that we get our buyer representation agreements over to escrow and that we include it in terms. You know how a couple of days before close they asked us to just write out some terms? They want us to make sure to include all of that. So far, no. I mean, the reality is that we're going to run into if we want to avoid situations where we're getting towards the end of an escrow and suddenly magically the buyer doesn't have the money to meet one of their obligations. Well, it's like any other deal, right? If they didn't have the ability to meet their closing costs or whatever, it all has to, our obligation is to vet early, right? So that's what that buyer financial form does. It says, where are you going to get this money from? Where is this other money coming from if you have an obligation to it? We'll do Brian and we'll do Sangeeta first.
So about this SPV,
Yep.
what is the ideal time to send it? It is before you send the offer or with the offer?
With the offer. Yeah, with the offer. It's automatic. What's that?
What happens if they sign the agreement, like they accept but doesn't sign the other side?
The actual offer actually is where the term is included. So if they accept the offer, it's been accepted. But this is something that they'll need to see. If I was working for the seller, I'd want to see this to know what that number was. Yeah. Let's go, Brian.
You know, I may have missed this, but what's the significant reason that is asking for the third page of the buyer brokerage?
For verification that there's an actual agreement. So this here is us attesting to it essentially, but the buyer broker agreement is the actual agreement between buyer and buyer's representative, and the seller can't be asked to take over an obligation of the buyer unless we can prove that it's an actual obligation that took place. Because I think what they're worried about, right, and what they're really explicit about in different paragraphs, like in the nitty-gritty of these forms, is circumstances where somebody tries to pretend that there is an obligation and they just think, I'll just get it signed later, kind of thing. The agreement that you're asking a seller to take over is a previous commitment with a buyer's broker. So they don't want people just checking that box and then producing, getting creative and producing buyer rep afterwards. So, yep.
And then does it make any difference if our buyer brokerage is 1%, 2%, and then on there we write 3%? Is there any difference? Like
you can, all you're going to get is what's in the buyer rep agreement. So they can't differ. You're only asking for what the buyer. It's only the buyer's commitment that can be asked for. So it has to be whatever the buyer's commitment was. They wouldn't differ. They couldn't differ. Yep.
So we have to send page 3 of the buyer book?
They have the right to ask for page 3.
Page 3 doesn't have any.
Is it page 3 or maybe page? It might be the last page. Can we go back to it? I'll show you where it is.
Maybe we can.
Can we go back to it? Maybe we can.
Where is it? This way?
Yeah. This is it. Go
page
to
one.
the end of it. No, but go to the end of it though too. I believe.
Oh, right, because there's a confirmation right here.
So right here, on the last page of the buyer rep, I said 3 because I was thinking it was the 3-page form. I apologize. I meant to say last. On the last page of the form, there's a confirmation of compensation. This isn't required. This is just something they have the ability to ask you for. And if they do, you need to be able to prove to them that you actually have an agreement. I want to point out before I take another question, I want to point out that when I started, because we got through the buyer rep pretty quickly, when I started with the buyer rep agreement on the first page, I talked about the fact that our old agreements, when we changed them to exclusive agreements, all you did is check a box. But the new agreement, you have to check a box and have your client initial. Here's where they're initialing on the last page.
So when we had the buyer broker agreement before, the previous version, we had to verify, which we could verify through MLS. Remember, it was like MLS or SPVB, that there was a compensation offered. Is that still a part of the buyer broker agreement? And we have to get that confirmation before we show a property now, or we are only doing the SPVB after when we're writing the offer?
Who are we verifying? Who are you talking to?
So when we got the BRBC before, if we were following it, when you looked up a property on MLS or you called the listing agent, you had to confirm that there was a buyer compensation,
Okay.
and then
She's
the
talking
buyer
about
had
the
to initial
ABCD, I
each one.
think.
You're talking about the
Yes.
ABCD. Okay, you're talking about a different form. That's
Yeah,
not the
yeah.
SPV.
So
So
it
the
wasn't
ABC
mentioned on any of
right.
these, that's why I'm.
The reason it's not mentioning is because I started this class to say that CAR changed everything.
Right.
And they don't want anything to do with broker-to-broker commissions.
Okay, so we don't have the
So
ABCD no
we're
more.
not,
Okay,
you
thank
know, until we hear differently, and we may hear, there's a possibility that we'll hear from our brokerage that they'll create something like a CBC, a cooperating broker form. There's a possibility, I've heard it multiple times, so that's the only reason I'm comfortable saying it, but I still wouldn't rely on it. If our brokerage creates something that allows two brokers to compensate one another, we'll get back into that territory where phone calls happen and we can guarantee from some of this. But I've been saying over and over in this class, you have to get this concept of buyer-broker, some guaranteed broker-to-broker compensation out of your minds. Your client is paying you, their client is paying them, or we're asking it for the purchase agreement.
But also we're saying that everything we learned over the last 6 months is different, completely
Because
different from what we're
8
doing
days
now.
ago.
Right, exactly.
8 days ago.
Well, and I'm only asking this
Yeah.
because I have a new client that is a builder, and
Yeah.
we're gonna have to figure out how to let people know what our compensation is without it being
So
blasted.
if you were paying attention during the class, we talked about this concept
I
of
took
concessions.
it, Daddy, come on, like-
I'm sorry, but we talked about this concept of concessions, right?
Yes,
Okay, so concessions is the
That's
answer.
the tool.
but from the buyer's agent, but how do we as the seller, it's only written there, like, how are we confirming with the other agent that it's offered?
So if there's a concession offered, the MLS is going to be updated with a line that says the seller may be willing to pay concessions, and then you'll have to verbally have conversations.
That's what I'm saying, so every time somebody calls the builder and I answer the phone, I have to say yes or no?
I neither sued Missouri myself, nor.
Oh, yeah, I will call our legal department and ask them.
Well, I'm answering you though. I'm saying that's the reality.
Right, okay.
We're in the
So,
reality.
yeah, verbally through concessions, not compensation, but concessions.
So we cannot do
Yeah.
CBC form.
The CBC has been removed from CAR's forms. They've yanked the Cooperating Broker Commission. So I'm going to go back to the beginning of the class. I'm going to say it again. Broker-to-broker commissions, the CAR wants nothing to do with. That's what a CBC is. It's a broker-to-broker commission. Broker-to-broker commissions, CAR wants nothing to do with them. The listing agent offered broker-to-broker commissions. CAR wants nothing to do with them. They wiped that out. So broker-to-broker commissions, you just have to realize, for now at least, unless we find a workaround, have been removed from the equation. So any communication of a concession can be made. So you can make communications on a phone call or wherever else that there's a concession available if your client has indicated as much, but it's not binding, like an MLS offering would have been binding. And it's going to have to be negotiated out. And the place for the person you've conveyed, that you've telegraphed the concept of the concession to, the place for them to deal with it is in the purchase agreement. You have to then ask for it in the purchase agreement. Brian?
Do you know when these forms will be out?
The 24th, July 24th, Wednesday.
So if we get a listing agreement signed, the current form
Yep.
now.
Joe, can we help?
Where are we going?
So we're going to go to the modification forms.
There you go.
Okay. Okay, disclosure and modification to buyer representation agreement. So the CAR gave us a couple of bridge documents to use between, to bridge over old obligations into the new format and the new thinking of the new world that we're in. One of them is this disclosure and modification to a buyer representation agreement. It goes through what these commitments are, et cetera, et cetera. It also states in red here, it says you will be solely responsible for the compensation amount in the BRBC unless another party agrees to that compensation, such as including a term in the purchase agreement. Again, as a term in the purchase agreement. Can we go down a little bit more? Modification of buyer representation agreements, that you can modify these documents. It took out, what it basically does, what we needed to bridge the old BRBC to the new BRBC is take out things like too much talk of the idea that there might still be a commission offer. The old BRBC says if you find out from the seller that they're offering commission in some other way and they're going to let you sign a CBC, et cetera, this this could happen. That's the kind of language the old buyer rep has. What bridges it and makes it the modern document is taking out any language that mentions anything about the possibility of a seller co-op commission. So this is the document you're going to use in the interim. And it's going to bridge us.
How about the listing agreement?
And next, disclosure modification of the listing agreement. Thank you. It's like having a plant in the room. Disclosure modification of the listing agreement. Again, it's gonna bridge us over to the new terms. It will no longer be available. There's a whole lot of language about there not being compensation or offered anymore. That the new listing agreement, our new agreement together, removes that discussion of you offering a cooperative commission agreement. Yeah, Michelle.
What's the form? What's the form called?
The form on top of it is the disclosure modification of a listing agreement.
DMLA.
So, Michelle? Did you have something, Michelle? No? Okay. Anybody else? Yeah. Natasha.
So if we have a current RLA, but we're not closing escrow until after this date,
Yep.
then I need to go back and get a modification?
That's right. Yeah.
Even if you're in escrow?
Even if you're in escrow.
That's what I'm
asking.
So if you're in escrow and the term is going to end, I'm going to need to come back to you on that. That's another complication. If you're in escrow.
Because
Yeah.
if you could show the MLS for the compensation.
Yeah, you know,
That goes away.
my instinct is that, you know, a commitment is a commitment, and if you've got the commitment and you're running through an escrow and terms have been provided and all the rest, that you're probably going to be fine, but I'll have to check that out, right? Because really all that's happening on August 17th is that they're removing it from the MLS, right? I mean, that's the major thing that's happening. You're not going to be able to offer it from that date forward, but if it were previously offered and there's already an agreement and understanding. Yep, Ida?
Is it expecting on the 17th MLS to have that option?
Yeah, so the NAR rules go into effect on August 17th, and the MLS updates are like August 12th, from what we're hearing from the
Yeah,
MLS.
and that's when both compensation goes away and this new concession field gets
That's right.
added.
I'm not sure about Bridge, and I'm not sure about other MLSs in terms of the concession field, but I have heard from Bay East that they'll be doing the concession field.
MLS listings?
I'm not sure. The only one I've heard from is Bay East,
yeah.
and I've heard that the NAR General Counsel thinks that most MLSs
Yeah.
are going to have this
Bridge will
concession
be
field.
Interesting to see the MLS, which our MLS is a compilation of all those MLSs. Interesting to see what it looks like.
Yeah, you know, if there's I would imagine if there's a data feed trying to send something over that they don't want, it's just not going to appear on our MLS, Brian?
Oh, no, I was just gonna say, since the new form's coming out next week, I was thinking if I should send the paperwork to the seller now or later. That's all.
Yeah, so we talked about this a little bit. I got a call from somebody this week who said, I have something cooking, but it's not really, you know, it's pretty much verbal right now. And this person is not afraid of losing the opportunity. I said, just do it next week then, right? When it comes to these ones that you have going right now, I would say between now and then, you should get the modification done at least so that you're in compliance. You know, some of this is, we're just trying to be in compliance with what our professional association is demanding. And so, you know, I don't know how policing's another story.
So, the current listing that's on the market, not in escrow, we still get this?
Yeah, you do, because a current listing that's on the market and it's not in escrow, on July 12th, all of a sudden you're 2.5%, 3%, August 12th, what did I say? Is going to, August 12th, is just gonna go away. So yeah, so you need to inform your client and let them know, because what we're doing in our agreements with our client is we're saying, you're gonna offer this, we've agreed to it, you're gonna allow me to advertise that here, blah, blah, blah. So something substantive has changed in your marketing plan, so that you have to give them this modification. Yeah.
Can we request from BRLG or
Yeah.
from you, like some language that can go in like the confidential remarks if we are planning to offer compensation?
Yeah, so
Concession?
concession.
Concession.
So I think that this is going to be key, right? And we're waiting for our apparently our attorneys are actually working on a whole bunch right now to try to help us, but we haven't got an inside look at it. One of the things I would want to know is exactly what you're getting at. Like, can you provide us with the proper language? You know, the concession thing, there is a concession checkbox that we're expecting on the MLS. But what about our other marketing materials? And how do we say in a flyer, right, seller might be willing to concession? So I didn't want to go down all these unknown roads, but you've got a really
But
great
we've got
point.
active listings now
You've
and
got a
that
really
are
great,
coming,
you've got a really great point. So we're hoping to right now just leave what you have as is, but in the coming weeks, there's going to be some forgiveness for a little while. This is car rules and all of the rest. We just need to get ourselves up to speed. They really gave us these documents 9 days ago and told us we're going to give them we're going to introduce them in 2 weeks. I mean, that is kind of absurd, but that's where we are. Yep.
What I'm thinking is that as I get closer to that date where it's no longer gonna show, and I have some buyers interested in property, I'm going to print out those MLSs that are showing a commission, and then I can call the agent and say, you know, you were showing this. and
Is
now
the
you're not.
concession still on the table?
Yeah.
I think that the verbal stuff is going to be a big part of the way that we're doing business, because then we're going to write it in. So you were asking about phone calls and stuff. I do actually think, and I hate to commit to it, but I do think like we're going to be on the phone and we're going to find out somebody might be willing, if they get an offer for this much, that they'd be willing to talk about a concession for this much, at least kind of giving us a sense of, yeah, write me that offer.
That's why the
Right.
ABCD was like, it
It
was
was
confirmation
good.
of it, but now it's gone.
It's gone, because that's just the way they are, and I'm with you. But Natasha?
If I have some current RLAs, but they're not coming on the market until August with no concessions, that means either 5 or 6% total where the sellers already agreed to both sides. Do I still have to do a modification anyway? If the
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, you have to modify, you have to have a conversation with the client. Yep. John?
Just an opinion,
Yeah.
I don't think broker compensation is coming back at all. Just within the last 24 hours, I read an article about how the DOJ is launching an investigation into CAR.
Yep.
And I have read other places where the DOJ is adamantly against broker compensation.
Yep.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah,
don't count on it.
so I think that's, we have to end soon, but let's end it here. Let's get back to your very good question of like, why did this all happen? And why did it happen to all of us like last minute? Well, honestly, in June, we thought we had a path, right? We even talked about it here. We thought that there'd be a CBC. We thought that, because they released drafts to us that gave us every reason to believe that would be the case. CAR did. And then somebody else stepped in, and I've heard it's DOJ stepped in, to your point, and said, whoa, you're about to release something in 2 days? We want to see it. And then Carr said, everybody stop. So that's the limbo we've been in. Everybody, every risk management attorney, every broker, every brokerage, the whole state of California has been in limbo. And then they gave us these forms and they took out all of those other ways to do it. And to John's point, this is the world we're in. Broker getting a commission from their client is the world we're in. Maybe there's ways to offset it in the purchase agreement by a concession. I don't see it getting less conservative. To John's point, I don't know. We'll have to see. But I think the DOJ does not like realtors.
No.
That's can we get me off of YouTube before I say too much more? So we'll have to see. We'll have to see where it goes. But this is where we are now. And you know what? Here, let me end on a positive note. How many of you were in business during REOs and short sales, right? I'm sure a bunch of people in this room. How many of you were in the business during COVID, right? Like, how many of you remember all of a sudden somebody's telling us we had to do this PED thing every time we walked into a property, and then we had to walk around with Lysol and hand sanitizers, and in the beginning they told us we had to bring vacuums to properties. Like, if you're going to show your client, bring a vacuum with you so that when they leave you could do it. And we had to adjust and adjust and adjust, and there were like overlays that seemed like we're never going to be able to do this. We're a smart group. We really are. I mean, There's some exceptions, but we're pretty smart in real estate, and we wind up figuring out ways to adjust, and I believe that'll be the case. Brian?
The piece reminded me, are we still doing that open house thing where everybody needs to sign?
Can we bring those up right now?
Can we?
Yeah, I was gonna wrap up, but I do want to show those.
Let's tie a little bow around these modifications, though.
Yeah, Joe wants to tie a bow.
When are these necessary? So this is the RLA one, this is the BRBC. Are we still here? We're almost done. Let's get this finished up.
Yeah.
So these are required to be signed before, I'm going to say August 12th,
Yeah.
for any RLA or BRBC that was created before next week's forms release.
That's right. So it's going to be
Period.
available next week, but it's really August 12th is August 17th is really our date where we have to be in compliance with NAR, et cetera. So that's when we want you to get things cleaned up in your files with modifications. Let's go quickly to those open house forms, and then I'll let everybody.
Here we are.
And then what we're going to do after that is we're going to build a big fire outside, and you all are going to put me on top of it, and then we're going to light it on fire, and I'm going to scream, "I didn't do this!" And then we'll open house visitor, non-agency disclosure, and sign-in. So this concept. So one of the major concepts, right, that we talked about earlier on is that we need an agreement every time we're working with a buyer before we show them a property, and so that made everybody go like this too, like every time I start to get involved with a buyer and show them a property, and one of the things that realtors came up with was, what about if I'm sitting in an open house? Am I showing that buyer the property? Am I now in violation of all of our NAR rules, whatever? And so NAR came up with the workaround for that, which is this open house visitor non-agency disclosure and sign-in. And this form, kind of like the non-buyer agency form I talked about, hey, I'm not really working for you kind of form, this form is actually for the open house sitter who has people come in, and it doubles as a place for them to give you the contact info and tell you who they are, et cetera, tell you if they're working with an agent, and for you to tell them in disclosure form, essentially, anything I'm doing here today is on behalf of the seller because I'm sitting this open house. I can represent you if you'd like me to, but we'd have to work out a different agreement for that. But until you tell me you want me to work for you, I'm really just here. You know, I'm not liable for you as a buyer. And the way that I would convert the person at that open house, if they do say, we do want you to represent me as a buyer, we love you, we think you're fantastic, is that we could either get a buyer representation agreement, get this like long-term agreement with them, solidify a real relationship, or we can use this quickie form, the possible showing and representation agreement. Quickie, it's a couple pages, like 2 or 3 pages with just a really short grid rather than the 5 pages with lots of terms in the buyer representation agreement. And this quickie form basically is only for 3 properties. So it's only, it's a more pinpointed, tailored, like I'm helping you here, I met you here at 123 Main Street, you do want me to start acting as your representative, and you're promising me that if you buy this house, that you're gonna give me a commission. This could actually come in kind of handy, right? Like when you're at the open house, they sign in, you tell them that I'm working for the seller until you tell me otherwise, you hit it off, you say, you know, I can really look into this for you in great depth if you're not working for with anybody else. Let's just get a quick agreement signed that if you buy this house, right? I mean, I think that there could be a way to script this so that it's, you know, both helpful to the client and, you know, helpful to the open house sitter. You're making an agreement that can't exceed 30 days in this. So it is really just like to facilitate my ability to act on behalf of your interest as your client. And it says, but if you buy this house, you know, I'm going to be owed a commission. We can always convert this to a buyer representation agreement later, right? We can always, if we actually develop a good relationship with them, and we can kind of on the fly get a quick relationship going. Yeah?
But if the visitor has signed some agreement with
Yeah, so actually there's talk about that in the sign-in sheet. There's talk about like that they need to be. First of all, our question to, where is it exactly? If holding a visitor should sign a representation agreement, such as property showing form, if visitor is in an exclusive relationship with another agent, this is not intended as solicitation. So part of our conversation with the form and with the client always, and has always traditionally been, are you working with an agent, right? So now we're gonna have to convert that, that line that we've used forever. Are you working with an agent? Are you working for an agent? And do you have a commitment with an agent? Do you have a signed signed agreement with an agent. I mean, that's just super important anyway. Yeah, Frank?
What happens if they don't want to sign anything with it?
What if they don't want to sign anything? Oh, so if they refuse to sign it, this was asked on one of the car town halls, and the car attorney said, we can't tell them get out of this house, right? Because we have the fiduciary to the seller, but we should note down in our own notes that somebody refused, right? And that we should be really careful then about any information. We should tell them, as I said to you, in order to communicate with you, I need to first disclose to you that I'm working for the seller and have you sign. I have to give you limited information until you sign this form. Anna?
So this will be part of the real estate market, like buyers, visitors will get used to these forms in 6 months, 1 year. They'll be common in any open house.
Yeah.
My question is, are there any marketing materials that, or suggestion card comes up, so we can share this in advance, so people will be like, what is this? So we can give public information, so they get familiar with the new.
Yeah, I don't think it's a bad idea, actually, what you're bringing up, to actually just print some of the draft samples to your clients that you're sending to open houses and tell them that you can expect to see this form. And also, it'll give you maybe an opportunity to talk again about your representation, because I think we should be sending our buyers to open houses and telling them, make sure you're clear that you have a representation agreement in place. Because, my fear, or one of my fears with this whole situation is that, buyers don't know what they're, people just are carefree about what they're signing and they don't remember what they signed or what they agreed to. So I think we are going to have to get better at saying, again, we have this exclusive agreement, so when you go to that open house, tell that person. And we're going to have to get better at asking that question too. Have you signed anything with a realtor? That kind of thing.
Did you say take a picture, a picture?
Yeah, actually, one of the town halls said that with these open house visitors, it came up as just a question, and the attorney said, "Great idea. Have the person coming through the open house take a picture of this after they signed it, so that they have a copy also. But also have your client have a picture of their buyer representation agreement in their phone." So that if an agent at an open house or somewhere asks, "Do you have anything signed with your client?" Particularly if you have an exclusive, get a picture of it so that you're because that says stay away to the agent at the open house. Yep.
I'm gonna have this weekend, so I need to have this?
No. No, and it's actually not even available for you to have yet until July 24th. Yep, Sangeeta?
So there is no broker cooperation.
That's right.
So how the things will go, like now the listing agent puts the supra box, buyer agents go access that. But there is no obligation for each other now after this, right?
We still belong to the same professional association, and all the other rules of the same professional association still apply. So in terms of proper etiquette by showing a house and all the rest, it's all still.
Because there was a cooperation and the compensation, you are like following all the things. Now listing agent also can think, right?
No, we're still obligated by all the rules of our association. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up because that was a lot. Here's what I want to leave it with. I'm available. If anybody wants to text me or call me or tell me tell me that thing that they thought of in the middle of the night that's gonna be a complication. I probably already thought about it, and I probably am up in the middle of the night at the same time. So call me then. I'm kidding. But there are bumps that we're all there are going to be bumps in the road. There always are with changes. But where I kind of was trying to leave things before when I was talking about PEDs and vacuuming properties and dealing with asset managers for REO sales, and we as an industry deal with big abrupt changes, and we generally come together as a community and figure them out. And a good takeaway right now too is every realtor in California is having this conversation with their broker right now. And I only say that because there's a in that, right? Everybody for a while is going to be in the same boat, trying to navigate through we have a pretty good roadmap, but there's going to be a couple of unanswered questions that have to get answered along the way. And as a community, we're going to figure it out. Okay? Thank you. Sound good?
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye. Bye, YouTube. All right.
Woo! Marathon.
Which one do you want? So I have a form now that's like an online request form, and everybody that applies, we have to execute. Okay,
Clients?
Are you good?
No, I'm good. I'm just like, what do you mean I was taking all the notes and I still confused? So I didn't realize that the ABCD form went away.
Oh, yeah.
I didn't understand
All of
that.
these
Yeah.
cooperating groups are like hard, like white their whole world.
Yeah,
Anything
okay.
that
That's
they
why they
don't-
like put it out and then they were like, never mind, and then they were
And
putting
then,
it out
and then they
again.
threw it on us and all of a sudden it looked good.
Yeah, because I just had a meeting with the builder and explaining them that we need to do the ABCD and the CUD and like their version of it, so go bring this to your lawyers, and now I was like, but I'm taking a class on it next week. So